into the side of the mic.
This is the side of the mic.
I know. I'm just joking.
Am I doing it? Don't you know about the bird? Hey, everybody knows that the bird is a word. Bird's a word.
Can we just open with this? With George just jamming it out? Bird is the. Can I just hit record?
I think it is recording.
It is recording.
Welcome, everybody, to Bobby Talks, ... Those dots are there to tell you that there's always more to the story. Today is a big day for me. I've been trying to get this man on the show for at least, I don't know, since the beginning, the conception. Sitting here with my oldest of friends, my bestest of friends. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Conversations with Friends, episode 4. I'm sitting down with the man, the myth, the legend, William Delzeith. Will, how you doing, buddy?
Pretty good. Glad to be here. I love the setup. The last time I recorded with you was on a former iteration of one of your podcasts, and a little different. But
do you remember the name? I'm just going to throw it out there. Do you remember the name of that podcast?
No.
Yeah, that's how bad it was taken. It was called Keep It Simple, Stupid.
Oh, yeah.
And I should have done more of what the name of the mantra of the show was, and I always overcomplicated it. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah, so right now, today, Will and I, when do you think we've been friends forever? I mean, I don't remember
Yep.
first grade, kindergarten. I don't remember exactly when I remember being friends with you. It just happens, right? When do you think it went from like sports, to like deeper conversations? When did that kind of develop for us? What do you think?
Well, I remember third grade and all of our math competitions, so that's not necessarily deep.
But no, that forms a bond because there was competition between the two of us.
Yeah, for sure. It had to have been in high school, right? Because I wasn't thinking seriously until 9th, 10th grade. I wasn't concerned with anything besides sports.
I think our biggest conversations, the only thing I could think of was, to answer my own question, I guess, is relationships. Right?
Yeah.
It was like, we always sit down and try to understand women and their thoughts and how that contributes to our emotions. And it would always end up the same way at the end. Robert, I don't know. I just don't know. There's no way to know how women think, right? So, and then I would say the same thing to you whenever you were going through it. So that's like the earliest reference for me.
Sure.
But we've stemmed those conversations, and they would go from relationships to sports to movies to religion to just so on and so on. I always kind of use this checkpoint in my life as the moment I stopped being just an athlete and started trying to be someone who uses brain. And I don't know if you remember this to you or for you, but it was a huge point in my life. It was our 19th. It was my 19th year of life. It was that summer we were at Morning Fresh one day.
Oh, yeah.
You remember this?
Oh, sure.
It was the first kind of conversation where our group of friends sat down and we had an intelligent conversation that average Joes could have, uninformed average Joes.
Very loud.
Very loud, unfortunately. That was us then, and some still are. To have a conversation on religion and God and just ask questions out loud that we'd never done before.
Right.
And in a very public setting. But I remember like taking those conversations, and it was like twofold for me. I took one side of it was I felt very guilty that we were saying some of the things that we were saying about God and religion out loud.
Right.
Right? The whole like, I feel like I'm going to be Smite type thing.
Yeah.
But the other side of it was like, it stimulated something for me. And I think we've had some really good conversations since then. What you remember that day? What's your thoughts on that night?
Oh, the first thing I think of is that we had to get kicked out of Morning Fresh because we were causing such a disruption.
A ruckus.
Like 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was.
Kids, learn from us. Do as we say, not as we do.
Right. But yeah, I remember it being centered around God and being a lot of kind of skepticism going on. And I was the main driver of that because that's,
I remember,
where I've been situated since about that age. But I remember just kind of finally feeling open enough and comfortable enough with some of my own thoughts to start expressing them inside my group of friends and not being scared necessarily to have those type of debates.
When you say scared, though, like, would it be like scared of us and how we might take them? Or scared of like whether or not you feel you're informed enough to have these conversations?
No, it's more along the lines of conformity, right? So you kind of are fitting into your group of friends, and a lot of things that you guys kind of share kind of bond you together.
Yes.
So you start to push on those things that you don't necessarily agree upon. It can be a little bit tough on those relationships.
Yeah, and it's kind of you're like, I kind of get to a point with us sometimes where we would go through it so often. Back in those days, we would we were pushing those buttons so often because once you kind of open that Pandora's box, it's like, oh, now we're off to the races. In my older age, I kind of wonder how. I think it's kind of inevitable that we're going to do that in your friend group. You're going to kind of start separating yourselves. Right. As we get older, though, and we kind of lose the closeness because of, just life happening. Everybody's kind of domesticated, or they're trying new things, or they're on their route. They're doing their own thing. I miss, and I just wonder if sometimes if that stuff really matters. It matters to identity, but I also wonder if it matters if in the realm of things, because we don't sit in coffee shops anymore and have those conversations about top surface stuff,
right?
Which is what brought us together. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It's just a food for thought type thing. I want to read you a quote. Okay. And this is something you just said to me recently. So I'm going to read it in its totality here. And then it's going to kind of lead us to where we want to go.
Okay.
We were talking about my last couple shows ago with the Conversations with Friends, episode 3. And there was a jar analogy about shaking the ants and whatnot. And you had messaged to me, you said, oh no, I was totally on board with the jar analogy. The jar itself is not evil. People as a group, society, etc., are organized because that's how human beings exist. However, there are people that exist outside of the jar. Think of the ultra powerful that manipulate how we think via disinformation. My thing's out of order here, but I was a Republican for most of my life because I bought into the bootstraps bullshit. And the Democrats are susceptible to the same type of disinformation. That's the shaker. Who are the people shaking? It's hard to say. Zuckerberg, people like Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, the owners of the profit prisons. They all have a stake in keeping us fighting about Dr. Seuss getting canceled or gender fluidity. I thought that was just well written. And some of the things that I want you to kind of clarify before we deep dive here.
Sure.
What do you mean when you talk about profit prisons? I kind of have an idea, but let's kind of set the table for our audience.
Okay, sure. So for-profit prisons is basically just about every prison that exists in the U.S. today is for profit. So they benefit from having people in prison.
Right.
And a lot of the laws that we have, a lot of minor laws that have to do with marijuana or have to do with crack or cocaine or any kind of drug,
continue to feed that system.
Right.
Right.
And they have a direct benefit for these laws being written. And there's actually connections. The people who own these for-profit prisons own groups of organizations that try to write legislation that benefit themselves. And a lot of that, this is all stuff that you can find in documentaries, especially something like The 13th that
right.
you can watch on Netflix.
Yep.
But and it'll be said better there. But a lot of these things, a lot of these people that own the for-profit prisons benefit from having people in prison.
Okay.
So that's why you see, mass
legislation,
incarceration,
right?
Legislation that kind of arcs people towards, like mandatory minimums is a great example. Like mandatory minimums mean that if you get caught doing something illegal, quote unquote, you have to go into prison for X amount of time. And small things like marijuana, we could argue about whether or not they should be legal, but
right.
we definitely don't think that people
they should be incarcerated for
right.
as long as they have been.
Yeah.
When did I don't know enough about the prisons for-profit prisons. Right. When did this start? Has this always been the model? Are you talking Gus Harrison down the street here in Adrian? Is that a for-profit prison, or is that just a state prison?
I wouldn't say that.
And why do they exist?
Right. Well, I'm not sure about Gus Harrison specifically. For-profit prisons exist specifically for the accumulation of wealth, accumulation of money into the people who own the prison's hands.
Yeah. See, now I've never heard of this, so when you put that down, I had to do a little research myself and be like, oh, these do exist.
Right.
I thought you were kind of just talking about this idea of like profit prisons for big companies, and we're all just kind of sheep into their thing. But this thing's real,
right?
That shouldn't exist.
No, absolutely not. And it actually, the owner of the Detroit Pistons accumulated a lot of his wealth.
Oh, that
Tom
way?
Gores, yeah, by owning for-profit prisons. So there's been a little pushback about him having ownership of
And whether or not he should even be able to own a.
right,
Makes
exactly.
sense. Where do you? Yeah, it's tough, right? Because if you look into a lot of these billionaires that own some of these professional leagues or professional teams, you could probably find a lot of things that are like, gray areas in some side, and to some people there aren't gray areas. They're very wrong, and they make money that way.
Right.
Okay, so you kind of clarified that. So let's get to my root question then. Are people inherently evil or good or impartial?
Well, I think that people are born not tabula rasa, right? Not like blank slate.
Right.
We are born with the ability to do both.
Right.
So our experiences in life, our situations, our environment, everything kind of leads towards one thing. But we have all of these choices present to us. So the choices we make along the way are either good or evil, but we have the capacity for both.
For both, okay. It's kind of like the power of observation that Matt was talking about a couple episodes ago. So since we have the capability of both, why do we so often if something feels evil, right? I mean, it sounds evil, it looks evil, we know it's an evil choice. Why do we make that choice? First of all, I should have said this at the beginning of the show. Will is a psychology. He has his master's in psychology from Toledo, University of Toledo.
Philosophy.
Sorry, I apologize. Yeah, philosophy from the University of Toledo.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you kind of know some of the reasons why, or at least you can understand some of the behavior traits of why we choose the things that we do. Why do we choose this route if we know it's evil?
Right. So the first thing I want to say is that we don't necessarily have to define something as good or evil.
Right. I agree.
So when we're talking politics, and we're talking about policy choices about whether or not to spend money on this program or on that program, it doesn't have to be good or evil.
Okay,
right?
good. Because that's where I come from. It just sometimes it feels like we generalize so much. It's like all politicians are evil. They're forcing us. They're the ones shaking the jar. And that's kind of where the conversation goes. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. There's more. Let's look through what's actually going on.
Right. But those are questions of ethics, right?
Right.
Those are questions about how we organize as people.
Okay.
There's the moral component that kind of lies on top of all of these questions, right? So, should there be kids in a wealthy nation like the United States starving?
Right.
Should there be, 20% of children in poverty?
Right.
When we have all of this wealth
And all this resources. Yeah.
Right. So that for me isn't an ethical question. That's a moral question.
Right.
The ethical question kind of comes in how do we organize our money? How do we organize our volunteers, if that's the route you want to go?
So that those problems don't exist in a wealthy nation.
Right.
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 What happens, because there's the ideology. It's very easy to say, simple to say, and then there's the actual, putting it, the pragmatic view of how can we make this in practice, right?
Right.
Not to go down too far with how to, figure hunger or child hunger in the States, but when you start dissecting some ideologies versus, when you start a company, the person that starts the company has the idea and they create all of these massive jobs, then you have to have all of these people that perform these massive jobs for that person that came up with the idea. So what is the limit there of how much, we use the term greed or whatever, how much should one be compensated for this idea that created a massive amount of jobs for people versus the labor of it?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think that's the question that's kind of driving a lot of our conversation right now is what we can do about inequality and how far we should go with kind of solving some of these problems of inequality. Is inequality good at all?
Right.
I don't know.
I don't know if it's good, but is it inevitable is the question.
In a system that we exist in now, yes, it's inevitable.
Right. But in order to, let's just throw out some ideas. Let's say we had a flat tax rate. Everybody pays the same, right? Even though I'm making, X amount of money, it's still going to be paying a lot more taxes than you are because you might be making less money, right?
Right.
That model doesn't work?
No.
Explain.
Because people who have massive amounts of capital are using more and more resources than people who aren't, wealthy or even, impoverished.
Okay.
So if you're the owners of Walmart, if you're a massive shareholder in Walmart.
Sure.
And you're worth $25 billion, $30 billion. And you have all of this real estate, you have all of these people under your umbrella, and you're using, massive amounts of the infrastructure that taxpayers have paid for. You are reliant on the system more than you or me.
Yes,
right?
totally agree. I'm just curious where you fell on it, because I used to talk. I know when we were smaller, I would talk a lot about like the woods analogy. You got two people who live next to each other, and they both need fire. They both need all this stuff. You have one guy that can go out and chop just what he needs and to stay warm, the basic necessities, and then the other guy is like, I'm gonna go out and chop all this down so that I don't have to do it again, right? And now he kind of has the market, and now he can kind of dictate what you have to do for him in that. And I don't necessarily buy into that type of philosophy.
Right.
So it might not match perfectly, but there's some things there. So, so I'm with you. I guess I've heard it kind of brought to my attention this way, that we might be more inherently evil or have those types of selfish traits that would lead to that than we are good, and we're capable of doing good. And we tend to, more times than not, and I don't agree with that, but it's been phrased to me that way. I just wondered where you fell on that. So
so that's a good question. One of the things that I think we sometimes forget when we're talking about like the difference between like selfish versus empathy, right, is a kind of good way to put it. We forget that both of those things are natural.
Yes.
Like I would never argue that we shouldn't be selfish, or
right,
that we should not be empathetic at all. Like, we need both of these things.
Right.
And when we talk about, people who are entirely selfish and lack empathy whatsoever, that can be problematic in a lot of different ways.
Does it feel like we're, as a nation, becoming less empathetic of each other, or is it just that's what's in our face? That's what we're looking for?
No, I actually think that we are becoming quite a bit more empathetic.
Okay.
I mean, Joe Biden was probably my last choice for president, at least from the Democratic side.
Sure.
Don't boil over. Pop's about to.
Oh, look at that.
Close one. But
I must slam that puppy down.
I mean, when you look at some of the things that he's doing, he's been super progressive.
Right.
I mean, more progressive than Obama.
Which is a lot of people's fears if they were in that middle area, right? Because they're like, oh, he's going to represent, the AOCs of the world and whatnot. But sorry, not to cut you off.
No. So, like, my fear was that we weren't going to be doing enough things.
Right.
Like, because we're getting to the point now where inequality is so massive.
Right.
The gaps are so wide that it's going to be really hard to kind of close those gaps a little bit. Like, we're talking about the type of wealth that kings and queens never even had.
Right.
Like, over their
It's
subjects.
astronomical, and you can't even, it's to the point where you can't even, fathom the numbers. Like, you just roll your eyes at it because you're like, how can one person have that much, right?
Right.
I don't know. I tend to think, like, I get the ideology of, like, we used to have these conversations a lot about, the idea versus the labor, right? But I always felt like, the idea is great, and it should be able to stretch it in how far it can go, as long as they are taking care of their employees and paying them a competitive wage and paying them a comfortable wage and living and so on and so on. And I think a lot of companies do that. I have a friend of mine that works for Google. She says that they're taken care of, tenfold, right? There's bonuses, there's incentives, there's, work breaks, there's parties, there's all these things that they do for their employee. Sure. So, like, whether or not that's true or not, that just might be one person's perspective of Google. I don't know. I'm sure there's disgruntled Google employees too.
Of course.
But then there's other companies that people talk about, like the Waltons and Walmart, and, how evil are they, and whether or not they should be on the forefront of fighting for these. They should be the ones that should be changing the minimum wage and setting the standard versus letting policy do that. But they're also a capitalistic company that's not going to do that. Yeah. So I don't know. I just feel like it can be found anywhere. But you're right. There's such a gap now between, and especially with the distribution of wealth, right? That the top 1% and the top 1% of the 1% is just, you can't even fathom these numbers. How do we bring that down to earth? And more times than not, when you talk to those people, they're willing to do more.
Right.
But it's the ones that are kind of on the other side of it that are fighting for this ideology of something that they're not even a part of. Isn't that an interesting dichotomy?
Yeah, it's, one of the things that's kind of commonly said is, a lot of people are worried about their future status as millionaires.
I've never heard that. That's genius. Yeah.
So our entire society is built on the idea of overcoming, right?
Right.
Overcoming our circumstances to be better, overcoming our parents' circumstances to be better. And when we have that mentality just drilled into us from the very earliest of ages, like all we're thinking about is what that outcome is going to be.
That pursuit.
What we're going to be someday. So when we think about what we're going to be someday and the wealth that we might hold and all of these things that we might have, we think of our future selves before we think about the people like us.
Right, that
ourselves.
actually live and breathe and look like us. And,
Right.
Yeah.
So now we have, an infrastructure bill that would like rebuild our roads and rebuild our airports and our train systems that's trying to get passed. And we have, a lot of people who would benefit from having better roads and better transportation that are fighting against it because it's going to cost, taxpayers X amount of money.
And right. Yeah, it's tough because the question becomes, it's like, okay, if you ask for more and you ask for more and you ask for more, when does that kind of end? And then you also have like the interpretations of taxes and whether or not they should have got this far,
Right.
Based on the ideologies of this country and what it was founded on. Where are you at with that when it comes to like, the founding kind of, the words that were used and the language that was used in the beginning versus where we are now? I mean, is it fair to hold a country to their ideologies that they were born and bred with and they must write it out entirely? Or is it fair to look at you, 200 some years, 300 years removed and say we are in a different society than they were and the language needs to now match that? Where are you at with that?
Our founders were innovators.
Okay.
And I think they would be disgusted that we're not willing to innovate.
That's a great answer. Yep.
All of the technology that we've produced, all of the wealth and all of the things that have come along with our society now, 300 years later, I think they would just be dumbfounded by our inability to innovate. A prime example of this is when we think about how we produce our energy.
Right.
So we have we get most of our energy from natural gas,
Yep.
oil, expendable products that we don't that hurt our environment.
Right.
That cause pollution, and then you hear things like in Germany, there's villages that are popping up that are actually being paid for the amount of energy they put into the system because of solar.
Kind of like an incentive program type
Right.
thing. That's nice. Okay.
So I think it's weird that we wouldn't be willing to innovate, right? To produce energy better, to come up with different types of energy to especially when you start thinking about things like solar, when you have
Right.
solar panels, and if you're producing enough energy that's going back into the system, you'd be paying a lower bill. So I just think it's like, to get kind of back to the point here, I think it's really weird that we're so fundamental about our founders,
Right.
when our founders weren't fundamentalists. Right?
So, all right, so let's talk about our founders then. So the great thing about them is that they were innovators, right? They weren't perfect people, right?
No.
Let's transition here if we can.
Okay.
To cancel culture, and I told you I wanted to talk a little bit about this, and we'll spend 6 minutes on it because I know you don't want to spend too much time on it.
Yeah.
But I when we're playing Call of Duty, it's not appropriate for me to be like, "Hey, Will, what's your thoughts on cancel culture?" While there's two other guys
Shut
playing.
up, there's a guy on the left over here. Right?
Yeah. So the question becomes like, we have basically a landscape of kind of honoring these people. They're on our money. They're statues all across the country. They're in museums. And then there was this movement, especially last summer, of taking down and, really saying that none of these people were perfect human beings. They were a product of their time, but we decided to, instead of honoring those people anymore, we decided to degrade the statues, pull them down. And now it's like we will never find a perfect human being in the past ever again because you can find something linked to them.
Right.
It's almost like if you're going to be a politician today, you got to be a politician the day you're born, and someone's got to groom you for that position. And it wouldn't make you relatable by any means. But where are you at with the whole cancel culture and what's going on with? I mean, should those statues have been taken down? And if so, because of our current time, should they be destroyed? or should they be, kind of honored in a different place in a different way?
There's a difference between, say, a statue that's kind of a monument to somebody and a biography about someone who details their life in a meaningful way, right? So, like, a biography is trying to understand someone. In the instance of the fathers, we're trying to understand this man in particular, right? Even if we're talking about someone like Robert Lee, like if you're reading a biography about him, you're trying to understand that person's life and his circumstances,
right? And you have to put yourself in his shoes and his environment,
right?
Right.
But there's a difference between that and putting someone in the form of a monument, right? Like, why are we putting Robert Lee in monument form,
right?
Okay. So as far as he goes, especially since he was on the losing side, he was fighting against the country that we're living in.
Right.
I understand why people would want him taken down, especially in the African American community, because he was fighting on the side of slavery.
Slavery, sure.
So it's more nuanced than that. I understand.
Right.
Big picture. It's to kind of get away from it a little bit. The founders and kind of talk about it in more of a current context, like as far as like canceling
Dr. Seuss,
or Bill O'Reilly, right? I would understand, and I do understand, like why Bill O'Reilly doesn't have a job at Fox News anymore, right? But there's a weird red herring that's popped up when it comes to cancel culture, right? And this is the thing that I was kind of saying I didn't want to talk about, but I'll talk about it a little bit.
How about for another 3 minutes?
Okay. The red herring is Dr. Seuss isn't being canceled.
Right.
So we hear the idea of cancel culture a lot coming from people on the conservative Republican Fox News side, right?
Right.
They say Dr. Seuss is being canceled.
Right.
And it's like, no, he's not being canceled, right? So if you didn't hear, Dr. Seuss's publisher, people who are still publishing his work, canceled a few books. They decided to stop printing a few books because they had some pretty awful depictions of African Americans, of Asians, and they, as an organization, as a privately held organization, decided they were going to stop.
Fully within their right to do that.
Right. So that's different, though, than someone who has been found and not necessarily tried, but has been fired because of sexual harassment. Right?
But I don't know So let's talk about Dr. Seuss. Was there pressure from, even though they privately made a decision, like did they get in front of something, or was there public pressure from other entities that was putting that on them and they kind of Monday morning quarterback something? Because that kind of feels like that's happening all over the country, in different areas too. So the question is like, and I know Disney, when they put up Disney Plus, when they put that forward, I think, 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, whatever it's been, they've taken out some of their old time stories that they had put in there. I forget the one, something with the South.
Yeah,
I
can't remember the name, but I know what you're talking about,
and they took that out completely because they said it was showcasing, it was putting slavery in a positive light, right? Mm-hmm. Should these, they had the decision to do that, but if it's coming from a public pressure and they're kind of folding to that, should we all just fold because public pressure is there, or should we? I guess I'm stuck. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know where to go with it.
Sure. And I think this is a tough conversation. It's not as easy as just saying yes and no, because everything
is case by case.
Yeah, it's case by case. So, I'm trying to think of a different example. So, like with the Disney instance, like there is sometimes private interest and public pressure align. Right. And it's okay for that kind of pressure to maybe influence a decision. I'm trying to think of another example that's kind of like where I would disagree with that type of influence, that type of pressure.
To change something, yeah.
Right. So I guess maybe the first thing I'm thinking of is like all of these different organizations like Nike or Coca-Cola or, whatever one we want to talk about that came out after George Floyd's death. Right. Or murder. These organizations are putting out all of these, Black Lives Matter, tokens, expressions, that don't necessarily influence how they operate. Okay. In any way or form. It's just it's a a picture they're putting up that says Black Lives Matter, and that's not actually changing anything.
So let's stop there.
Okay.
I don't know if we can kind of come back to that without talking about the cancel culture, but just maybe talking about people and companies.
Okay.
We'll do that. Here's what we'll do. We're going to come back on the other side of the break. We've got the camera still rolling. I'm sitting here with William Delzeith. He is my oldest friend, my best friend, and we'll come back on the other side of Bobby Talks. All right. Welcome back, everybody, to Bobby Talks. ... You know why those dots are there? Sitting here with William Delzeith, my oldest and best friend. We've been sitting here, I don't know, 30 years, we're 34, 28 years of friendship. Not sure. I just saw Jessica, what was her name? Stewart. Remember her?
Oh, yeah.
She's working over at the bank, at TLC Bank, and she was like, how long have we been friends? And I was thinking, man, 26, 27, 28 years. It's hard to believe that we are people that can have friendships of that length, isn't it?
Right, yeah.
I'm sitting here with Will. He was once a student over at University of Toledo, and he was also for a year was a professor.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And he was a professor of philosophy. And if I am correct in reading what I'm reading here,
Professor.com or something.
So I found something when I was Googling Will's name, because people that you might not know this, but our man is disconnected. He's off the grid. He is no longer on social media. Probably best for him, because he gets very, very going. His I don't know what your miles per hour or words per minute is right now on the keyboard.
About 79, but I'm out of practice.
He's out of practice. He loves a good conversation, and actually, I think he probably hates the conversation. It's just hard to resist the conversation. I found overall on ratemyprofessors.com.
All right.
William Delzeith. Have you ever looked at your Rate Your Professor?
Not in a long time.
Well, I think you'd be happy to say or hear that you are rated a 4 out of 5.
Oh, cool.
Which is very good. I'm playing DJ
How
with
many?
the screen here. Of 2.
Broad sample there.
I'm going to read you one. Nobody specifically said anything about you, but they talked about your class here. It says the class was made up of 3 unit quizzes. Is this correct?
Yep.
Okay. It says in one final paper, there are weekly journal responses, and it's an easy A.
Yeah.
If you do your journals and score well on the quizzes. It says that you got a quality 4 out of 4 stars, or 4 out of 5 stars, and you got a difficulty of 1.
All right. Well, that was my goal. So
Hey, then
I didn't want to be one of those professors that made everything hard.
Yeah, you want them to feel engaged, right?
And you're taking probably the classes I was teaching. I think it was probably contemporary moral problems.
Yep.
It was, I think, a 2,000 level class, which means you're a freshman or sophomore taking it.
2,400, philosophy 2,400.
So when you're teaching those classes, 90% of the students in there, 95% of the students that I had didn't care about philosophy. So I'm not trying to ruin their semester, right?
Right.
So I'm just trying to make them show up to class and engage with the work a little bit, choose the topic that they want to talk about.
You didn't want to Ted Mosby them with the architect, and when most of the kids there didn't want to be an architect.
Yeah, and I didn't know how many F's were in professor either. So
that would be that. That would be that. That would be that moment. I'm sitting here with William Delzeith. Will, we call him. We were kind of talking a little bit about the intentions of these companies. We were talking. We kind of we translated over to Black Lives Matter and that issue that took place. That's still going on. It's never going to not be going on. But hopefully the narrative will be a little quieter as we make our adjustments throughout time.
Right.
But we were talking about, you said that we talking about Nike and so on, and how they will post an image of Black Lives Matter for like a form of unity, but they don't necessarily stand for that. What do you mean by that?
So Nike notoriously owns, child labor shops all across Asia, right? So, I mean, if Black Lives Matter at its base is trying to say that all lives matter equally, right? But you have companies like Nike or Coca-Cola or Nestle who post these things and then endorse a type of labor that's way below the type of labor
of a human standard should be.
Exactly. And they're still kind of following these practices. So the question is whether or not these statements that they're making are arbitrary or if they actually mean them, right?
So the question then becomes is, since we are a global market, they're a global company, if they're utilizing a different country that has a different set of labor standards, right? Obviously, and I'm just asking the question. Are they not allowed to? Who says that our labor standards are the correct way, the righteous way, or the versus someone else's? first thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, our standards are different than Europe's standards, are
Right.
different than Brazil's standards, are different than, any other country's standards. I think when you're looking at places like India or you're looking at places like Indonesia, and you're seeing the types of living conditions that they live in, especially like deep inside of giant cities that have tens of millions of people in them, like like Mumbai or something like that, you can explicitly see that their living conditions are not up to standards.
Now, when we say up to standards, though, we mean the American standard, right?
Maybe.
Is that fair to say, though? I think that's what Jared Schmidt on a couple episodes was kind of saying, is that we try to indoctrinate the rest of the world to the American standard.
Okay.
And whether or not we should have to do that or not. Maybe do they like their standard? Are they happy with their quality of life there? Which I'm just playing devil's advocate here. So
Right. That's really tough because you have. I'm going to try not to go too deep here, right?
Sure,
So,
yeah.
a lot of new Marxist theory, right, since essentially the Frankfurt School, which was pre-World War II. So within the last 100 years, was trying to figure out this problem of how capital is global, but labor's not. Right.
Okay, yep.
So capital is allowed to go wherever it wants to extract labor.
Right.
But that labor isn't allowed to move with the capital.
Fair enough,
So
yep.
we got we've got companies like Coca-Cola or Nike going into places, exploiting labor policies, and then bringing all of that capital out of that system.
Right.
And the products come back to us. We get to wear the products. We get to have fun with the products on Instagram or whatever.
Right.
But one of the issues is, and I'm trying to get back to this American standard, right? Like, I don't think it has to be an American standard. It can just be a human standard. I'm not saying that people that live in Mumbai shouldn't be allowed to live in shacks
Right.
that are literally built
Sure.
out of tin, if
Right.
that's what they want.
Right.
But my guess is, as they're looking into the city and they're seeing, high rises that are going up and people owning whole floors in these high rises,
Right.
or the whole high rise itself, there is a disconnect there between how those persons are living in the shacks and
Yes.
how people that are living in better conditions. Because if the people that are living in those conditions, where they're digging holes to go to the bathroom,
Right.
or going down to polluted rivers to bathe,
Yeah.
if those were the good standards, then
It would be copied in the wealthier nations.
and the people that were wealthy in those nations would still live in those conditions, right?
Makes sense. No.
We're getting into some problems, though, right? Because like Hindu caste systems are traditionally horrid, right?
Right.
Because they have that belief in reincarnation. If you live with your conditions in this life, you get to go to the next life. And I'm not an expert here, but they have built into this reincarnation system. In their next life, they'll be able to move out of these
Right.
horrid conditions into a better one. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is if the conditions for living were good, then everyone would do them. There wouldn't be
Right.
people that excluded themselves from those living conditions.
I can't even imagine, I kind of him and Hall about the 2:00 in the morning. I got to get up and take a piss.
Right.
I can't imagine having to dig a hole at 2:00 in the morning. Knowing I got to be at work at 7:30, trying to dig that hole just to take a deuce there. That I would be very, very upset.
Right. And what's worse is their working conditions are, 16-hour days.
Yeah, even worse, right?
often when they're 10 years old.
So we were talking off camera a little bit about this idea of truth, and I know we kind of repeat some themes on this show, but it's okay because everybody brings a different perspective to it. Give me what your introduction to the conversation that we had, and then I got some questions I want to go off of it. So you were talking about truth and how we were so far on this show, Bobby Talks. We've been kind of showcasing it.
Sure. So I think the easiest way is just kind of say something blunt.
Right.
Like there is no truth.
Right.
Right.
Is truth, and that was what we had a conversation on that.
Right.
Yeah, is truth relative?
Yeah. So what's true about being human? We reproduce. We have a drive to reproduce.
Yep.
We need to eat. We need to supply those conditions. We need to supply the factors that meet those needs of
Right.
being alive, right? And
and staying alive, right? Like warmth and fire and things like that. Yeah.
There you go. So if you take this evolutionary approach and think about humans, 20,000 years ago, and then you think of humans today, there's not much difference in how our brains and bodies work, right?
Okay.
So what we've done since, the hunter-gatherer days has built all of these different systems that produce the things that we want, right? And in the system that we live in now, a capitalist system, we take some of the things that are natural to us, like this idea of overcoming our conditions in life, and we build it into the system.
Right.
So what we're taking this natural, survival, and we're putting value into it that might not necessarily need to be there.
So I'm going to stop you in your thought because I have a thought. So if this is called Will Talks, then you would have got to keep going. No, I'm just joking. So with what you're saying though, is we're talking about overcoming, and the question that you posed was, should we overcome? Right? Should we have to live in a system where we have to overcome anything? Right? And I always ask the inevitable question, right? Aren't these things inevitable? If you take your system at what point, okay, throughout that evolution process, should the system have stopped and that capitalism doesn't come into place where people are like, oh, I can just do more of this and then I become more important in the society and then I can get more things or whatever, leveraging our positions or whatever.
Right.
At what point should that have went a different route and what should that model look like? And I know that's a tough question for anybody, but I'm just saying, I mean, you're saying that truth doesn't exist because, and you're using this point of reference. What should it look like? How do you have a different, where you don't have to overcome something?
Right. I don't think overcoming would go away, right? Because it's kind of built into our.
You're just going to have different levels of it,
right?
Depending on whatever system you're in.
Right. The question is whether or not we can overcome overcoming.
Okay.
Okay. So the problem that we often have when we're talking about the human condition is we are always kind of thinking as if evolution has stopped, right? We're not on, as if we have reached our end goal.
Okay.
So the problem that we have is that we're taking the systems that we've created and thinking that there's nothing that can come after this, right? So we think that capitalism is the final truth.
Right.
We have good conditions for living for a lot of different people, and we can't really change this system anymore because we
got to preserve this system because it's shown to be profitable and, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the perfect system.
And we have naturalized it in such a way that makes us think that it is the truth.
Gotcha.
So my issue is, have we built a structure that is human, or have we built something that we can start to pick away some of the pieces in order to understand whether or not there's a better system to live in, a better system that we could create?
Well, it comes back to that pursuit word, right? You and I had this conversation a long time ago, and I think it was the most genius thing you said that the most genius thing that they put into the Constitution was the pursuit of happiness, right? This constant pursuit. But pursuit is the key word there, pursuit of anything, right? Yeah. You should constantly be trying to pursue a better everything, right? That should be the natural progression of things. I had the conversation with a guy about racism in America and whether or not it exists. Well, of course it exists, right? Yeah. Whether or not it's better now than it was 50 years ago, it should be better now 50 years from now than it is right now. And the only way it will is if we continue to push and continue to pursue that better tomorrow, right? So I kind of get what you're saying. The system needs fixed in different areas, and it should be fixed. Yeah. However, I always kind of feel like sometimes, we talk about, and maybe I've switched a little bit on my idea of capitalism. It's just the idea of, people, you're right. This isn't the end. We shouldn't look at capitalism as the end of it, right? If there's something that's better, then show me, and I'm willing to go that route. You know what I mean? I just sometimes I wonder if it's inevitable to get to this position because people are going to use their resources to leverage against each other. Right. And I just wonder if you're always going to have, because you're going to need ditch diggers the same much as you need, Elon Musk, right? So it always feels inevitable. And I guess I just say, well, to damn with it, and I'm just a part of the system now. And I don't know if that's the right way of thinking about it either. But
Well, I mean, I think that there are needs that are more immediate than thinking about things on an ideological level.
sure, that's fair.
I mean, for example, the most obvious example is I didn't go pursue a PhD because it wasn't feasible for me and my family.
Right.
Like I would love to be a professor long term, but
Sure.
in order to make that a feasible income, that's not, peanuts.
Right.
You have to have a PhD.
Right.
And so I transitioned into something else. I can still do some of the things I was doing in philosophy, but not in the same way.
Yeah, and
But those needs for my family and for me were immediate. So I
Right.
had to kind of enter into a system that I understand the contract I've made.
right.
And whether or not that has to be long term, it is not, inevitable.
Let's look at poverty. Let's break down poverty, okay? Within the system. I totally understand that, like, I don't look at majority of people as, we use the term evil. I don't look at majority of people as lazy. I don't look at majority of people as, some have higher privileges and they are inherited into certain situations. Others work very, very hard to overcome. And then there's those that are, victims of unfortunate circumstances who, the job market is just completely left them behind. And they were sold a tale of, you're going to go to school, do this, then you work in this job and you sign this contract and we'll take care of you long after your time that you've worked with us. That was a lie too, right? So you have victims all over the map, and then it kind of tells you, so what do I do if I'm 45, 46 years old and I've been driving truck for 25 years and I still got another 15 to go before I can collect any pension or collect any Social Security?
And in 7, they're going to have self-driving trucks.
And in 7 years, it's going to be self-driving trucks. And now I'm out of a job. And what am I supposed to do at 53 years of age when I still have a family I've got to provide for, and I still have a life and a quality of life that you promised me?
Right.
So what am I supposed to do? Now I go, so those people exist. The poverty, those people do exist because they're victims, right? Let's talk about free will a little bit, right? And we've had those conversations. Let's not go too deep into free will. But let's talk about choices that human beings make.
Sure.
Okay. I teach at a very small school, and I do sometimes feel like I'm dragging some of the seniors across the finish line, as any senior would, right? But trying to push them into the next level of their life, where at different schools they have different SES statuses, it just might be a given. Okay. There are, sometimes there are lazy people out there that under a perfect model or a perfect system or a more pursuit of a more perfect system, you're still going to have layers. You're still going to have your poverty or those that are considered poverty within that. How do you overcome them? How do you fix that issue of motivation and, things of that nature? Because that exists too. And I see it on not on a high scale, but I see it. It's definitely exists. And I would think it would move the needle a little bit.
Right. Man, it's just a big question, right? So I'm trying to figure out like
I guess my greater point is I feel like it's inevitable that we're going to have these kind of hierarchies. The question is, how big should the gap be for all those hierarchies, I guess?
Yeah. I guess I'll just kind of turn and start talking a little bit about like some of the bigger problems that have influenced a lot of the wage
Gaps.
Wage gaps. So the first one that I think of is since the 80s, since Ronald Reagan became president, CEO wealth has grown 300 times, right? It's probably a little bit more than that at this point, but a CEO of a Fortune 500 company.
Reaganomics, right?
Right. His money, his income has increased 300 times. And the regular wage earner at those companies, his wages have gone up 9%.
Right.
So what's the difference in that? Because math is sometimes hard, right?
Right.
If you make $100 and your CEO makes $1,000, if you increase your earnings by 9%, you're making $9 more.
Right.
So you're now in 45 years, making $109, where that same job, those same skills were paid at $100 all those years ago.
Right.
Whereas the CEO who's making $1,000 is now, what's the math on that? $300,000?
Yeah, 300,000.
Yeah. So you see their income, their input into the system has been valued at that. So now what we're doing is we're creating these giant gaps
Right.
that aren't just problematic because of the difference in wages.
Right.
But what's happened is that, the money was supposed to be reinvested into the people that work at your company.
Yes.
But it hasn't. What's happened?
Which then gets reinvested into your economy, which
Your community.
and it builds everything up. Yep.
Right. But now we're entering an age where community doesn't matter anymore at all.
Right.
But that's not necessarily where I want to go. What I want to say is what these CEOs, what these companies have done by increasing their income, by increasing their profit, and leaving labor behind, that money isn't going back into their company necessarily. It's either one, going to shareholders, or two, it's going into like lobbying government for different rules that allow them to increase their profit even more.
Right.
It allows them to exist outside the borders of the United States and
Have influence in different countries, governments, and different,
to increase their profit even more. So now what we see since Clinton, since NAFTA was signed in, I think it was 93, but it might have been 94, so fact check me. We've lost almost 80,000 factories in the United States that have moved from the United States into other countries. So that's 80,000 factories. I don't know how many workers have been affected by that, but those workers who were, maybe not necessarily where they wanted to be, but were living a good life, were able to provide for their families.
Yeah, at one
no
point,
longer have
yeah.
jobs.
Yeah.
So what we've seen, and these numbers are a little bit old because I haven't done the research in a few years, but
How much, real quick, but how much of the outsourcing of that has to do with the tax that the administration that's current might change? You know what I mean? So like I've always heard, and maybe I've never done enough research on this to know, but I think to the common man, and we've always heard that like, oh, Democrats, they come in and they increase the tax increase onto these companies, and they just go to other countries to perform these duties at a much lower rate. So how much of truth is that versus what you were just saying? I mean, is it fair to bring that point up, or?
I think it's fair to try to bring that point up, but that's because we don't necessarily understand that we're talking about the wagon before the horse.
Okay.
Right? So the things that have led to companies being able to hold the leverage of this idea of lower taxes over us was foreshadowed and followed some of the things that have happened since the 80s. And it's, I'm trying to be impartial here because it wasn't just Reagan.
No, I know.
It was Bush, followed by Clinton, followed by Bush. And it was all of this things were happening in succession that took money out of the middle class. It took money out of the working people's hands and put it directly into these companies, CEOs. And what those CEOs and companies have done is not invest back into the workers.
Right.
They've taken the working class, and they've either shifted them into other industries, tech industries, or retail, or any of these other industries, and just left them behind.
Well, I think about it in just terms of like, in education and the way that we've, kind of made that a capitalistic venture, right?
Right.
And how I would become a major player in the game as far as like single man. I don't have a family. I've got a decent paying job that, I can take care of me. I don't know what my bills would look like with, just the average size of American family, a wife and 2 kids.
Right.
I don't know if that would be enough to do it. But like, I know that I could buy a house if I didn't start every month paying 1098 in student loans.
Right.
But part of me says that, you've taken on that contract at that time, knowing that you had to do those things.
Right.
So there's that kind of it's like, I understand, but I also try to honor, my loyalty to contracts sometimes too,
Yeah.
So like, there's 2 sides of it, but like, yeah, I know that I would become a major player if somehow the money was, if we invested into education in a different manner and I was more free to spend the money that I've now made that gave me this education to get this job. I understand that part of it,
Right.
But like, I could become a bigger player in the economy, and I can't, right?
Right.
I'm sitting here 34 years of age and we're renting.
Right.
So,
Well, I understand. I have that same mentality, right? And it manifests at work because I work at the post office.
Right.
I deliver mail every day, and I work hard.
Right.
Like, I just don't have it in me to
not.
Honor the position, as some of the regulars say, right?
Yeah.
I have that hardworking mentality. I have that allegiance to the contract. So I understand where you're coming from. But what we need to reframe the definition of this conversation, right? And I had a professor that used to say, you'll never win a debate if you let the other side set the terms or the definitions of the debate.
Okay.
Because they're already taking you out of...
You're not playing in the same
Right.
playing field now.
Okay, so about student loans. Why should we honor predatory loans?
Well, because we entered into them knowing they're predatory at the time.
Why should our government be okay with the fact that they were predatory loans taking advantage of millions of Americans?
I'm not saying they should have. Okay. I'm saying you had a choice to find a different way. And I understand you can argue whether or not I have a choice or not, right? That's the fundamental argument, right? Do I really have a choice? What is my choices here? You do kind of have a choice, though. Like, you could try to come up with something as an entrepreneur that you think is an idea that might get you to whatever. Mm-hmm. You could go to a factory job or something that doesn't give you that higher level education. Right. I'm trying to figure out like where the accountability is on the individual versus just always putting it on the government, because I'm somewhere in the middle on it. I look at it as like, well, I didn't have to know. I knew I was getting into these predatory loans. I knew I was, but I didn't know what my other choices were because I wanted to become a teacher, or
we shouldn't let there not be a choice, though.
Right.
We shouldn't have let these terms be what we're talking about. Like, honoring something that's predatory like that, jacking up interest rates and making people $50,000 in debt, that shouldn't be the choice that we have between that, honoring what we want intellectually and what we want to do to provide for ourselves monetarily, financially.
So I agree with you. I do. Mm-hmm. There's parts of me that because you're a hard worker, right?
Right.
And I'm a hard worker, and I like to look at the accountability always. Like, it's just how I am. I'm always like, okay, before I come to you with a problem, I better make sure that I was perfect in my execution of my end before I say, hey, look, this is bothering me, whatever. Right. With that being said, isn't it, at what point can I no longer argue that something is predatory? Like, predatory to me feels like truth. It feels like perception. It feels like relative. Right. So I'm arguing what I think is predatory versus someone else's version of it, and it's going to look completely different. When does that slippery slope end? Because this is clearly predatory to us. Mm-hmm. Is it fair to say that it's not to others because of the capitalistic nature or whatever, the system that's favored them? I'm sure they're going to argue differently. Is there any point there? Is predatory just perception?
Well, it's so hard because I guess I'm having a little difficulty kind of understanding exactly what you're asking.
Well, if I'm saying that student loans, I entered into a predatory deal, right? Okay. You understand? You follow me so far? Yeah. Right? I can take that type of mentality towards any other situation where I feel I'm being wronged on something, but still went forward with it because of, I could argue that, well, I went forward with it because I had no choice at the time. But now that I've made that decision to make that choice, now I'm stuck with the consequences of that decision, that choice. But yeah, I could argue I should be bailed out of this because it was predatory. Or you know what I'm saying? I guess I don't know a tangible.
No, okay.
Did you get there? Okay.
A little closer.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're okay. So here's the other way to look at it is it's detrimental to the United States in general to have this much debt sitting on people's pockets.
Totally agree.
Or out of people's pockets. I don't know. So if we kind of change the tune just a little bit and start talking about how much more beneficial it would have to have all of these people with more disposable income to put back into the economy, into their communities. I think that's another way to kind of frame the conversation that doesn't have to go down that predatory. So there's, when you're making a logical debate, you can have a faulty premise.
Right.
And still have it be a valid argument, right? If you have
I do that all the time, Will.
You have 4 or 5 good premises to stand on. It doesn't matter if you have one that's bad.
I'll tell you what, it flies, man. I don't know how to explain it other than you just have to experience it firsthand. Will's just experienced it firsthand. That's the hour. That's our YouTube hour right there. We're sitting here, Bobby Talks, Season 2, Episode 4. I really appreciate being on the show, man. It's been a blast. We're going to actually go into our overtime part of the show, but do you want to say anything to our YouTube listeners right now?
subscribe. It's a good show. And those 3 dots are called an ellipsis.
Yes.
Just so y'all know.
There's always more to the story because of that ellipsis. All right. Hey, so we'll see you on the other side. Bobby Talks. You know the ellipsis story? Did I tell you why that's there?